What's up guys, Asian here again with another sort of build basics video, and today we're going to be talking about buffs, debuffs, and status effects, namely the three different status effects, or I should say 5 different status effects you can get from enchantments. That is burning, concussed, chilled, poisoned, and technically diseased is also a fifth status effect, although it's not really called diseased in game. This should hopefully be able to, will kind of let you guys know which buffs are important, kind of the most common ways to get these buffs and debuffs, which ones you want to focus on in your various roles. And for the status effects specifically, kind of clear up some misunderstanding between some of the status effects. So we're using UESP's buffs page here. This is pretty much more or less up to date to all the different sets and all the different sources of all these different buffs here and debuffs. So I highly recommend checking this out if you guys want to pursue each individual set or source of a specific buff or debuff in the game. I am going to hide my video just because there are a couple I am hiding part of the screen. Right. So we're going to start things off. Let's zoom in a little bit just so it's a little bit easier to... Alright, so starting things off with buffs, they do it in alphabetical order. So the first buff is known as Aegis. It's both minor and major. Pretty much all of the buffs and debuffs have a minor and major or a source of minor and major. There's probably one or two exceptions. But Aegis, you basically take 5% less damage from dungeons and trial monsters. The sets that you can get minor Aegis from are basically all trial sets, so you can't get this buff from any sort of like potion or any kind of ability. It is the 3-piece bonus on all the sets you see listed on the right hand side here. Now, for DPS, you probably won't be seeing or using minor Aegis at all because, again, it's on a set, and if you take a look just really quickly down all these sets, they're not sets you'll be running as a DPS. You would typically be having this buff as a healer or as a tank. Tanks most commonly get it from Yolnahkrim. Healers most commonly get it from Olorime. There are a couple of other sets in there that do also offer minor Aegis, but those are less used in PvE. Notice that it is 5% less damage from dungeon and trials monsters. So Aegis does not help you in overland content because that's not a dungeon or trial, and obviously doesn't help you against PvP because players are not monsters. Major Aegis comes from 2 different sets. It's 15% less damage taken from dungeon and trial monsters. It comes from Automated Defense and Inventor's Guard. These both are sets that come from Halls of Fabrication, the heavy armor, and one of the light armor sets respectively, and you get it when you use an ultimate. It applies to the user of the set and 2 closest allies. Not a very common set to see being run either on a tank or a healer or even on a DPS. So typically speaking, you will not be seeing Major Aegis being used at all in PvE, and of course, like I mentioned earlier, PvP, it's useless because it only helps against monsters. Next we have Berserk, which is a very important buff both in PvP and in PvE. Minor increases your damage done by 8%, major increases damage done by 25%. Minor Berserk, the most common sources are all listed there: Bird of Prey, Camouflage Hunter, Combat Prayer, and Slime Craw. The most common way to get it is through the use of Combat Prayer from a healer. Slime Craw is used in Asylum most often. Sometimes it's also used in some other trials where you might not have good Combat Prayer uptime, like Cloudrush, for example. It might be one instance where you might want to run Slime Craw. Bird of Prey and Camouflage Hunter are kind of situational. Bird of Prey obviously only on a Warden, if you have the bar space to run it. The Camouflaged Hunter grants you the minor Berserk when you hit an enemy with a critical hit on a flank. So pretty situational. Usually you'll be getting minor Berserk from Combat Prayer. Major Berserk now, this one is a little bit rare to see in PvE. So this comes from a couple different abilities and sets you can see there on the side. The sets are both fairly weak in PvE, so you won't really be seeing them used all too often. Heemjas might be beneficial in trash pulls because it gives you the Major Berserk whenever something dies. So it might be useful that way. Same thing with Reaper's Mark. Reaper's Mark gives you the Major Berserk on a Nightblade whenever something dies, so you might have some situational uses of those 2 sources of Major Berserk, but usually it's going to be coming from the Summon Storm Atronach ultimate from the Sorc, which will only give it to one person who activates the synergy. So not a very common buff to see in raids, but if you have a lot of Mag Sorcs or you have a Sorc healer, you might see it being used every so often. Next we have Brutality, both minor and major. So there is a typo here. It should be 5% for the minor Brutality, increased weapon damage by 5%, not 10%, I should say, not 5%. The most common way to get minor brutality is through the Mountain's Blessing passive on DK. So whenever DKs use an Earth and Heart ability, they give out Mountain's Blessing for up to 20 seconds to everybody around them. And so it's the only source of minor brutality outside of using an increased weapon power poison, which you typically won't see being used in PvE. Major brutality increases weapon damage by 20%. There's a multitude of ways to get major brutality. Momentum is probably the best way to get it across all different classes. I should say it's a class agnostic way to get it. So pretty much every single class has a way to get major brutality. Obviously not very useful for magic DPS, it's more of a stam DPS thing. But the most common way to get major brutality is from the increased weapon power potion, because that also provides you with major savagery as well as restore stamina. So just kind of you kill three birds with one stone by using the potion. So while there are abilities that offer major brutality, most commonly you'll just be using potions instead to get that buff. Next we have Courage, both minor and major. These are both just straight increases to weapon and spell damage. The buff is affected by major and minor brutality or sorcery, so this is buffed up to by all your percent modifiers. So for stamina DPS, for example, it is affected by things like agility, which is a medium armor passive. The only source of minor courage right now is Claw of Yolnakreen, both the perfect and the non-perfect set, so a tank will be providing that usually. And major courage, you're going to be getting it either from Olorime or Spell Power Cure. Olorime is by far the superior set over Spell Power Cure, so that's usually the source of major courage. So basically there's only one source for each of these, and so Olorime will typically be on a healer, Yolnakreen will typically be on a tank. So that's how you're going to get those two buffs. As a DPS, you're obviously not going to be getting this yourself. It's going to be coming from your support roles instead. Empower is a buff. There is no major minor. It just increases the damage of your next light attack by 40%. Couple of ways to get it. It's not really something you see used very often. Magplars will typically be the one that are going to be getting empowers through the use of Solar Barrage. Two-handed stamina DPS will also get empowered fairly often by using Wrecking Blow as a spammable, but other than that, you're not really going to be seeing too many ways to proc empower, so it's not a really important buff that you should be focusing on getting. Major and minor endurance just increases stamina regen. Major endurance comes from your restore stamina potions, so those increased weapon power potions, they give you the major endurance for the additional stamina regen. There are several other sources of major endurance, but restore stamina potions is the best way to get it. Minor endurance, the most common way to get minor endurance is going to be from enchanted growth from a warden healer. There are other sources which you can see listed there, but those are far less common to get, or they're specific to a single class. Enchanted growth is a heal that a lot of warden healers do use, so you'll typically be getting minor endurance from your warden healer instead. Minor and major evasion are very helpful for survivability. They reduce damage from area of effect attacks. So minor reduces it by 10%, major reduces it by 25%. And it's really great for trials and dungeon survivability. A lot of attacks actually do count as area of effect attacks, so they are affected by the evasion mitigation. So it is really strong if you're looking to progress stuff. The only source of minor evasion at this point is Deceptive Predator, so the only people who can get minor evasion are going to be the wardens. Major evasion, you have a couple of different ways to get it. They're pretty much all class agnostic. So you have Blade Cloak from the dual wield line, and you have evasion from the medium armored line. Blur is Nightblade specific, so Nightblade tanks, for example, run Blur very well. Just gives them a lot of additional mitigation. And there are a couple of other sets here that will also provide major evasion. Out of all of them, the one that you'll probably see being used most often is going to be Gossamer, which provides major evasion to other people when you heal them, and Histbark is just when you're blocking on a tank. So those two are probably the most common that you'll see, but it's not a very common buff or sets to use. So don't expect to be using major evasion very often unless you're using one of the two abilities, Blade Cloak, Blur, or Evasion to get it. You'll pretty much always have it on Nightblade tank, but stamina DPS, you typically won't be using it unless you're in a kind of sort of progression group and you kind of want the additional survivability. Next, we have Expedition, which is not particularly useful in PvE in most cases, unless you're speedrunning, basically going for scores. Minor improves movement speed by 10%, major improves movement speed by 30%, and you have all those different ways to get minor and major Expedition. Again, not very commonly used in PvE content unless you are pushing for score and you need as much want to reduce time as much as you can, in which case you will usually be using something like Rapid Maneuver to get that movement speed. Major Minor Force is next. These are pretty strong buffs. So minor increases critical damage done by 10%, major for critical damage done by 15%. More useful in PvE because PvP, you obviously have impens, which reduces the critical damage that you deal. So the most common sources of Minor Force is going to be from Accelerate and its morphs and Trap Beast and its morphs. There are other ways to get it, so Stalwart Guard provides it as well as those other sets, but Accelerate and Trap Beast are the most common ways to get Minor Force. So DPS, you will need to get your own Minor Force. Twilight Remedy, not very useful, and Sogvins is a set that you could run as a stamina DPS, but usually it's better off to run something like Lachesis and Deadly Strikes, or Lachesis and Reliquin, just for more DPS. So you will be getting this from either Accelerate or Trap Beast. Major Force, the only way to get it is from Aggressive Warhorn. You could also run Lights Champion, but that's only provides it for, I think, up to 5 people. Aggressive Warhorn gives it to everybody in the group. So no reason to run Lights Champion at all. You typically will be getting from Aggressive Warhorn from your supports. Fortitude is health regen. Again, not particularly useful for DPS. Only one source of Minor Fortitude, that's from Restoring Aura, so only Templars can get it while they have that ability slotted. Major Fortitude comes from your Restore Health Potions. DPS won't be using it, and as well as Dragon Blood from DKs. So tanks will definitely always have pretty much 100% uptime of Major Fortitude. But health regen is not a very important stat to focus in on PvE, so you can pretty much ignore this. Even as a tank, it's usually not very beneficial for your overall survivability. Gallop is just movement speed. It's just the same thing as Expedition, except only when you're mounted. The only way to get it is rapid maneuver, and you can't mount in trials, so obviously not very useful. Important thing for PvP, but PvE, don't need it because you can't mount in trials. Heroism is important for tanks. Usually you won't be able to get this as a DPS. There are ways to get it as a DPS, but you don't necessarily want to give up ways to get it. So minor heroism, the most common way to get it as a tank is to run Heroic Slash. Carve does also grant minor heroism, but it's not very commonly used. There are a couple of sets there that also grant minor heroism, but these are all heavy sets, so DPS not really going to be using it, and tanks, you already have Heroic Slash, so you don't need to run these sets either. Major heroism, the most consistent way to get it is on a Warden tank using Shimmering Shield. You can also use the set Daedric Trickery, which is a crafted set, but that also grants different major buffs on a kind of rotating basis, so it's not a very consistent way to get major heroism. So Warden tanks, if you guys are able to use Shimmering Shield, I highly recommend doing so because you just get a lot of ultimate when you have that major heroism going. Major Minor Intellect, this is just magical regen, 10% for minor, 20% for major. Minor Intellect, the most common way, much like Minor Endurance, is through the Enchanted Growth move that Ward and healers will do. You also have Empowered Ward, which is granted to the group if a Max Orc is running it, so there's 2 ways to get Minor Intellect. Restoring Aura is Templar specific, and then Major Intellect only comes from Restore Magic Potion, so Magic DPS. You will pretty much always have Major Intellect going. Stamina DPS and tanks, usually, I should say, Stamina DPS won't. Tanks and healers will also usually be getting it either from Tripods as a tank, or your increased spell power potions as a healer. And again, Minor Intellect, the most common way to get it is through Enchanted Growth, or if you have a Sorc, Empowered Ward. Major and Minor Mending are very important buffs for healers because it increases your healing done. So Minor provides 8%, Major provides 25%. The most common way to get Minor Mending is from the Healthy Offering and Sacred Ground passives. Templars are the ones that are going to have the best Minor Mending uptime, so that's through Sacred Ground. Nightblades can get it through Healthy Offering. So those are the 2 most classes that are able to get Minor Mending. Major Mending will normally be either from... there's basically 3 classes that can get Major Mending. It's either going to be Nightblades with Essence Drain, DK healers with Obsidian Shield, and Warden healers through Accelerated Growth. So pretty much all the classes except for Sorcs get a source of mending through their abilities. It's not really worth using a set to get Major and Minor Mending as a Sorc because then you're giving up some sort of group utility. So generally speaking, not really worth it. So unfortunately, Sorcs and Necromancers, you guys are going to have to deal without the mending buff. So you will need to invest a little bit more heavily into spell damage to get the same amount of healing power done. That being said, pretty easy to overheal in this game, so not a big deal if you're missing Minor or Major Mending. Prophecy provides spell crit, so Minor Prophecy gives you 6% additional spell crit. Hold on, wait, no. Minor Prophecy gives you, I think it's 6% additional crit chance. Major Prophecy grants you 10% additional crit chance. They did change it recently. The only way to get Minor Prophecy is through the Exploitation passive on the Sork, so you need to use a Dark Magic ability to get it, and that'll be provided to everybody in the group. You can also use Spell Crit Poisons, but it's not worth it because you're giving up enchant on the magic DPS. Major Prophecy, couple of ways to get it. So Mage Light in its morphs is a passive way to get Major Prophecy as long as you have it slotted. But the more common way to get it is just straight through your potions, because your increased spell power potions will usually also have spell crit associated with it. So you will get Major Prophecy that way as well. So you don't have to run Mage Light to get Major Prophecy if you're running those potions. Minor and Major Protection, they're both damage reduction. So Minor is 8%, Major is 30%. Minor is mostly through for tanks. So you have Dark Cloak for Nightblades, Ice Fortress for Wardens, Spear Wall for Templars, and then for Class Agnostic you have Circle of Protection and Temporal Guard. You have sets and potions and poisons there, but again, sets and potions not really worth giving up as a tank because you're just becoming more selfish when really you should be more group oriented. Mage Protection usually is only obtained through ultimates for abilities. So you have Consuming Darkness on a Nightblade, Deliberation, that is a channel ability under the Sigic Order line. You have a passive that'll give you a major protection while you're channeling an ability. Empowering Sweep as a Templar, Light's Champion, that's class agnostic, that's a Special Staff ability. Remembrance, which is Templar specific and it only affects the caster, the casting Templar. And then Sleet Storm, which provides it to everybody. So Consuming Darkness and Sleet Storm provide major protection to people within a radius. The others provide it only for the caster. And there are sets listed down there that also provide major protection. It is very useful to have, less so on a tank because you already have so much mitigation as a tank, so it doesn't give you quite as much as a tank. But on DPS, it can be very useful for progression styles guilds to have somebody potentially run Sleet Storm or Consuming Darkness for the major protection during high damage scenarios. Resolve increases resistances, so Minor grants you 1320, and then a Major gives you 5280, and this does grant both physical and spell resistance. So I believe Ward is still on here, but they combine Resolve and Ward into just Resolve. So this should be physical and spell resistance, physical and spell resistance. Minor Resolve and Minor Ward typically comes from Combat Prayer. You also get it from Bound Aegis, Mirage, Ransack if you're running that morph to get the Minor Resolve. Stone Giant doesn't provide it anymore. Sturdy Horn, but nobody runs Sturdy Horn. Then Major Resolve, pretty much every single class has a way to get this. So Frost Cloak for Wardens, Lightning Form for Sorks, Rune Focus for Templars. Let's see, Spiked Armor for tanks. I believe no Men's Spirit is Sigic. Shadow Barrier, I believe, is a Nightblade. So this is the Nightblade passive that grants it. The only one that doesn't have it. It's missing the Necro ability, which also grants Major Resolve. Bone Armor grants Major Resolve. But usually as a tank, you'll be running Balance for Major Resolve, so that's where you normally get it. Then you do have Showdown and Mighty Glacier as sets, but again, more selfish, you want to be more group-oriented as a tank. Savagery is weapon crit, so 6% for Minor, 10% for Major. The only source of Minor Savagery besides the Poison, which you typically won't be running on a Stamina DPS because it doesn't deal any damage. Give me the Hemorrhage passive under the Nightblade line, so you have to deal critical hits as long as you have an Assassination ability slotted, and you grant the Minor Savagery to everybody around you. Major Savagery, a few sources of this, but the best way to get it is through that Weapon Crit potion. So this is your Restore Stamina, increase Weapon Power, and increase Weapon Crit. So best way to get it is through this potion. You could slot Expert Hunter as well, or Camouflage Hunter for, Major Savagery and Minor Berserk, but it's more commonly used just to get it from potions. Minor and Major Slayer increases damage done to Dungeon and Trial monsters, so basically the exact opposite of Aegis, which we mentioned at the beginning of this video. Much like Aegis, this only comes from Trial sets, so if you take a look at all the sets that provide Minor Slayer, these are all DPS-oriented sets that come from Trials. So Arms Reliquin, Laquestes, Sororia, False Gods, those all provide Minor Slayer. Major Slayer you can only get from Master Architect, War Machine, or Tooth of Laquestes. Architect and War Machine grants it on ultimate use to the caster and two closest people. Laquestes is only on the person wearing the set, and it's only when you use a synergy. So Major Slayer is a very strong buff to get, so it's really important that you have some source of Major Slayer. Most groups will try to find a way to get Major Slayer, whether that's through wearing Laquestes or having a support role I should say support DPS, like a Nightblade or a Magflar, run Master Architect or War Machine. Minor Sorcery increases spell damage by, this should be 10% for minor, and major is 20%. The only way to get Minor Sorcery is from Illuminate, which is whenever a Templar uses a Dawn's Wrath ability, you grant Minor Sorcery to everybody around you. Major Sorcery, much like Major Prophecy, is best obtained through potions. There are ways to get Major Sorcery, the most common one being Entropy, but much easier to get it just from potions. Minor Toughness only comes from the Maturation passive, which is only on the Warden, so whenever a Warden heals somebody, you get the Minor Toughness. You can also get it from running Warrior Poet, but why do that when you can just have a Warden healer? Minor and Major Vitality increases healing received by 8% for Minor, 30% for Major. Minor Vitality, typically won't be seeing it very often. The only two sources is going to be Green Dragon Blood and Mystic Guard. Again, not really useful running the poisons. Don't really run the sets because you're just giving up group utility. So DK tanks are pretty much the only ones that can get that major Minor Vitality. Major Vitality is also fairly rare. There is a way to get it, and that's through the Bone Surge synergy. Sorc healers, I should say Sorcs in general, can get it through Restraining Prison. So there are ways to get Major Vitality, but it's not really very important for DPS. For healers, again, not really important, and for tanks, it is a nice buff to get, but ultimately not all that important to get. And then Major Minor Ward, that's all wrapped up into Resolve, so we don't have to go over that. Next for debuffs, quite a list of debuffs here. So we have Breach, which decreases spell resistance by 1320 for Minor, 5280 for Major. The only way to get, I should say, the most consistent way to get Minor Breach is through Power of the Light on a Templar healer. There are Breach poisons, as well as 2 sets that provide Minor Breach, but these are a little bit less consistent compared to Minor Power of the Light. That's why Templar healers are usually, or a Stamplar DPS, is desired in endgame trials because they're the most consistent and only source of Minor Breach. Major Breach is pretty easy to get. Pierce Armor, Ellie Drain, those are pretty commonly obtained. Minor and Major Cowardice, not going to be seeing used in PvE. This increases ultimate cost by a certain percentage point. This is PvP. Defile reduces heat damage taken by 15% for Minor, 30% for Major. Again, not going to be useful for PvE because mobs don't heal. This is more for PvP. Innovation reduces crit damage. No sources of that in PvE either. This is more PvP oriented. The thing with Defile is that you can get it as a player from PvE mobs. So for example, you can get Minor, Major, and even up to Extreme Defile in various content. So tanks, just be mindful. Healers, be mindful. If Defiles are out, it will reduce the amount of healing that you're able to dish out. So while you will not be applying Defile in PvE content, you might be receiving it instead. Typically speaking, you can purge it, except in some rare instances, for example, the Extreme Defile in Black Rose Prison. Fracture decreases physical resistance by 1320 for Minor, 5280 for Major. Much the same way, the most consistent way to get Minor Fracture, like Minor Breach, is through Power of the Light. A couple of sets, and you can also get it from Focused Aim, but Lethal Arrow is the preferred morph of that ability there. Of course, Fracture poisons. Again, Power of the Light is the most consistent way to get it. Major Fracture usually comes from Puncture, just your tank's taunt, so really no reason to use any of the other abilities here. This is outdated. Surprise Attack does not actually provide Major Fracture any longer. Hindrance reduces movement speed, not important for PvE, more for PvP. Lifesteal is an important debuff to apply because it basically restores health to everybody per second done. The most common way to get it is through Blood Altar. Force Siphon is probably the next most common, and then Leeching Vines is another way to get it if you're running like a Warden Healer or Warden Tank. Typically it'll be a Warden Tank, but you'll usually be getting it from Blood Altar because Blood Altar also provides a synergy, which provides quite a bit of healing done. So really important thing to get, and Minor Lifesteal does proc anything that involves healing done. So it'll proc things like Maturation, it'll proc sets that require you to heal people, as long as you are the source of that Minor Lifesteal debuff. Minor Magicka Steel, very important for Magicka Sustain, Magicka DPS Sustain. Most common way to get it, Elemental Drain. Siphon Spirit, you can also run that if you'd like, and Restoring Aura for kind of an AoE Minor Magicka Steel. But most commonly, it'll be Ellie Drain from a healer. Minor and Major Maim, these are debuffs that are kind of useful in PvE because it reduces the damage that's incoming to the group. Most common way to get the minor maim is through low slash / heroic slash. Most common way to get it. Major maim you can only get through Vicosa, the set, Nova, the ultimate, that's the Templar ultimate, and Frozen Device, which is the portals for Wardens. So not a very common way to get major maim. A lot of progression groups will have Nova for high damage scenarios to help decrease the damage that's incoming. The most consistent way to get it is through Vicosa, but you only get it for 3 seconds every 15 seconds. But it's on demand, so and it's consistently able to get it versus Nova, where you have to wait for the ultimate to get up. Mangle has no effect in PvE. Uncertainty, no effect on PvE because it reduces crit chance. You will not get these two debuffs applied to you either. Vulnerability, probably the strongest debuff in the game for DPS. Minor increases damage taken by 8%, major increases damage taken by 30%. Most consistent way to apply minor vulnerability is through Fetcher Infection on a Warden, either a magic DPS, stamina DPS, tank, healer, any of the roles can apply it. You can also get it from those 4 sets down there, but Fetcher Infection is definitely the best way to get it at this point. And then major vulnerability only comes from Frozen Colossus, the Necromancer ultimate. There are a bunch of other buffs here, but these are, you can't take them into trials at all. So there's no point really talking about them. These are quest-related buffs. Again, can't bring them into trials. Now for status effects, there are, let me see if UASP has it. They do not. So we're going to go into each one of them individually. The first one is Burning. So Burning is procced by most sources of fire damage. It basically deals an initial hit and then it lasts for 4 seconds. And so it deals damage every 2 seconds for those 4 seconds. So you have the initial hit, which is considered a dot hit. Then you have 2 other hits from the dots. Again, it lasts for 4 seconds. The easiest way to get it is through a fire damage enchant on a weapon. And you can see here that it's a 20% base chance of applying it. These are other ways that you can improve that chance. So for example, Combustion, which is a decay passive, increases the damage of the burning effect, and Elemental Force is the Destro Staff passive, which increases the chance of applying burning. Then Fiery Rage, you always apply it when you use the ultimate. Now, there are other ways to get it outside of the fire enchant. Again, that's just the most consistent way because it has the highest base chance, a 20% base chance. So other ways to apply it is basically through any other source of fire damage, with the exception of light and heavy attacks. You cannot apply it from light and heavy attacks, and that's the same for Concussed with lightning damage, Chilled with ice damage, Poison from poison damage. Actually, you can't even deal poison damage for light attacks or disease damage for light attacks, so why am I talking about those? But yeah, light and heavy attacks can apply status effects. The way to apply status effects is through the fire, shock, and frost damage. You have 20% chance with the enchant, like I mentioned here. Then the next highest is going to be with single target abilities, so that would be something like Force Pulse. That gives you a 10% base chance. Next is single target damage over time abilities. Those give you, I believe, a 3% base chance. So those would be things like Destructive Reach. And then the last way is through AoE damage over time effects. That would be things like Unstable Wall of Fire, Unstable Wall of Elements. That has a base 1% chance. So the best way to apply it is going to be through a damage enchant, but you can apply it through single target abilities, single target damage over time abilities, and AoE damage over time abilities as well. Light attacks, heavy attacks don't count. Single target is going to be the best with 10%, and then the AoEs, just damage over time. Single target is 3, AoE is 1. So just stick with that enchant instead. But Burning is a dot. Next we have Concussed. So Concussed is on shock damage, pretty much the exact same thing, exact same ways to get it. This does not deal any additional damage, it just deals the 1 damage right when you apply it, and then it also applies minor vulnerability as sort of a secondary effect. They are considered separate debuffs, but essentially it gives you the same debuff. They don't stack on each other, so you can't get Concussed and minor vulnerability to stack. So essentially you can treat it as a minor vulnerability. The other thing with Concussed is that you need it before you can set anything off balance. There are ways to set enemies off balance, but this is the most consistent way to get it. You basically set the enemy Concussed, and then you have Wall of Storms, so either Unstable Wall of Storms or Blockade of Storms, and that'll set the concussed enemies off balance. The most consistent way to get off balance is just to apply concussed, but it only applies a single tick of damage, so people who say that concussed is a dot, they're lying. It is only just that one hit. Next we have chilled, which procs off of frost damage. Much like concussed, it is only a single tick of damage, and then it also applies minor maim. And much like minor vulnerability and concussed, you can't stack minor maim and chilled at the same time. You can pretty much treat them as equivalent debuffs, just that chilled procs off of frost damage. And again, it's not a dot; it only has one tick that happens. There are a couple of interesting things that you can do with chilled. So for example, Wall of Frost will immobilize chilled enemies, but that's pretty much it for chilled. Next is poisoned. Here, I think I need to actually look it up. Poison damage, perhaps. There it is. The poisoned is another status effect. It's pretty much the stamina version of burning. So it applies damage over time, and it ticks every 2 seconds. It lasts for 6 seconds, so you get the same 3 ticks that you would get from burning. So 1 at the first, next one, actually no, that's four ticks of poison. So you get the initial tick, 1 at 2, 1 at 4, 1 at 6. So you get 4 ticks of stamina. 4 ticks of poison damage. Much like the other status effects we mentioned, it can proc of any source of poison damage. Light and heavy attacks are the exception, but light and heavy attacks don't deal poison damage at all. And then diseased is also on here. This is by dealing disease damage, and while you apply disease damage, you also suffer from minor defile. Again, you can't stack them, so you can't have diseased and minor defile combined. You pretty much treat them as identical debuffs. And that's pretty much it. So I have links in the description below to pretty much all the links to the UESP page with all the buffs, so you can take a look at the different sets, different sources of those different buffs. And then I also provide links to the burning, concussed, chilled status effects, the poisoned and disease status effects that we have here. And I believe Alcast has a pretty good website as well, so I'll also have that linked down for status effects. So if you guys have any questions at all, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hopefully you guys found this informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.